I'm Bob Minton. I'm Colonel of the Army of the Ohio Civil War Reenactors. And a year and a half or so ago, some of the guys came to me and said, Bob, we're hearing about a movie project. Are you hearing anything? And I said, no. I said, if you give me some information, I'll see what I can find out. It came out that they were looking for someone to bring Civil War reenactors as extras to help fill out the story and give it some Civil War background. And I didn't know the entire story. So as I started to talk to Kim, the director, we went back and forth. It came out that they were looking for a Civil War regiment that had been at Philippi, the Battle of Rich Mountain, Corix Ford, that they could historically wrap their story around. So I did some quick research and I found that the only unit close to fitting that bill was the 14th Ohio Volunteer Infantry. They were at Philippi and Corix Ford. They were close at Rich Mountain, not heavily engaged, but they were in the vicinity. And that was very fortuitous because the unit that I reenact just happens to be the 14th Ohio. It also helped that a friend of mine, Kathy Jones from Toledo, is a huge 14th Ohio historian. So that gave me a great resource to start with. Once we realized we were going to do the 14th Ohio, we knew we would have to take some creative license to get the film characters into the story. But it was important for us to use real characters.
We started with Sergeant Reicheldifer. So once we identified him as kind of that centerpiece of the core group of soldiers, we just looked at other members of Company C that we could bring to life. So all of that group of 5 soldiers that are introduced as Sergeant Reicheldifer's men, you know, those were real guys. John Billings, Jacob Wolf, Benjamin Conrad, which was Corporal Conrad. Those were all real soldiers.
Well, for me, what was exciting about working on Light of Freedom was taking the official records, the historical records of the 14th Ohio and the battles they fought in, and bringing them to life, taking all the research that Josh and Bob did, and then creating realistic dialogue based upon the way people talked during that time, which I know about from diaries and letters and things, and creating realistic situations in the camp and on the battlefield that were interesting, compelling stories, but at the same time were real, were things that could have or did happen. And so we had a layout of what we wanted to do and progress through the various the battles that we were going to portray. And so we extracted the words and descriptions of the soldiers to kind of tie them all together. As I began to write the dialogue, inserting those original words of the soldiers, and then adding the connecting points to move the action along, and paying particular attention to those connecting points and making sure that those were also phrases and things the soldiers did and said that they actually did during the war, which comes, of course, from research and experience, both as historians and as reenactors. So that by the time we're done, we have a collection where we have got real words that were said by real people, real soldiers in these real battles.
Josh and I were going to be going to Ball's Bluff for a reenactment, and we were riding together and we decided, hey, we could go by the battlefield at Corix Ford along the way. We could go through Philippi along the way. We stopped at Harper's Ferry, and I can't resist a good bookstore, and we went in, and it just so happened they had one copy of the official records marked down to $5. I thought, well, that's interesting. And it just happened to be about Corix Ford, Philippi, Rich Mountain, and everything we were looking for. So we started digging through that on the trip, and really the first scene for the film came, in our minds, the first military scene, came to life there. We talked about how we wanted to portray the men marching in, getting their gear, never having really seen their gear, and having it issued and learning how to put the gear on.
The 14th Ohio left Cleveland. They stopped in Columbus just basically long enough to get their uniforms, get their initial set of equipment, and get their muskets. And that was the first the first scene we kind of sketched out. We had a notepad and we kind of drew, here's the tables, here's where all equipment is.
So as the 14th Ohio left Westerville and headed towards Western Virginia, it gave us a great opportunity to incorporate our civilians. I know there were a lot of civilians in the town scenes, but it was neat for us to be able to portray interaction between period civilians and the 14th Ohio. Elizabeth Topping did a great job of coordinating the reenactors on the civilian side for us. Just as we paid a lot of attention to detail in the military uniforms and how they looked, Elizabeth paid an equal amount of attention to the civilians and were they wearing the proper attire for what they were doing and how they looked. And there were a lot of close-up scenes when the 14th went through Beverly and they showered the soldiers with flowers. You know, a lot of the focus there isn't so much on the 14th marching by, but it shows, you know, the kids and their excitement and the adult civilians as they're marching by. The scene in Marietta where the ladies or the civilians bring the pies out was a great chance to showcase the ladies, because that was kind of bringing out, you know, a little dressier. You know, they were coming out to thank the soldiers, and you could see the excitement in the soldiers. You know, it was just something that obviously meant a lot to the soldiers, and it was enough that it, caused him to write it down, and it was a great opportunity to recreate that for the movie. The scene where in Beverly where the flowers are being thrown and given to the soldiers, the pies in Marietta, all those various scenes really happened. But when you see the scenes of the camps themselves, the way those camps are laid out, what the soldiers are doing, that's a result of reenactors, research, and putting into practice over many years as reenactors, so that when they have the opportunity to share this on the screen, that's a very natural thing, and we hope and we think it came across that way on the screen when the soldiers were in camp, that they were in a place that they were familiar with.
My brother Emery, I have just finished fighting in the Battle of Philippi. I could hear your voice encourage me. After leaving behind much of our gear, we marched on to Philippi in double time.
Philippi is kind of considered the first significant battle of the war. The 14th was there, so you got to think about these green soldiers. Up to this point, other than a few maybe small skirmishes or exchanging shots on picket duty, they had no way of knowing exactly what the battle was. As they were marching by, we filmed the scene where the lady reaches or looks out and sees the soldier, and she fires the pistol to kind of alert the Confederates that the Yankees were coming, and then a cannon shot. And the men were coming into Philippi, and the next thing you know, the Confederates are running out the other side. So the first major battle really wasn't much of a major battle, but it was the first experience for these guys. They were veterans, so to speak, now because of this one battle. They'd seen the enemy, and they had that confidence that they had experienced combat. The scene after Philippi, where the soldiers were, resting on the spoils of their first battle. We really tried to think about the things that those Southern soldiers would have had. So while you're listening to the story, you're looking at, the officer's sword, Confederate hats, the officer's binoculars that were on the table.
We can hear cannons in the distance. It is a small comfort to be safe in our tents, but I cannot help but feel for our comrades who have pressed on into the battle at Rich Mountain.
Fire!
Next, we go into the Battle of Rich Mountain, where the 14th wasn't heavily engaged, and I thought Kim did a nice job of tying that together with the letter. As they're writing the letter home, they talk about the battle in the distance, and you hear the cannon fire, and you hear the rain on the tent. And again, it was June in Western Virginia, so thunderstorms. It was very wet. There was a lot of static fighting at first. The soldiers were entrenched, and eventually just the overwhelming numbers of the Union soldiers kind of took the day, if you will.
Dear Bishop Hanby, Clay and I have returned to camp
and are now rested from the most intense battle I have fought since my recruitment. It was the Battle of Corrick's Ford. It all began in the early
morning of July the 13th. We had marched about 8 miles the night before and had set up camp in the woods. We had no tents and had not eaten.
The most challenging thing was the Battle of Corrick's Ford, because it did move for several miles. It involved a river crossing.
We actually took a trip to Corrick's Ford and to see the battlefield and what is left there. And that, helped us. Again, reading it on paper is one thing, but actually going and walking the ground, that helped us, bring it to life on the screen again and try to find a site in Ohio that matched it as best we could.
But it was literally, Confederates firing and then moving them back some, and then the Yankees firing and kind of stepping it closer and closer to the river.
We took the historical record, we folded in the letters from the soldiers. For example, the one scene where the captain has ordered the company to fire, then they're fired on, and he says,
"Steady, boys! The Almighty has blessed us and the rebel aim was high. Now we'll give it back to him."
That was taken from a letter from a soldier. So many of the lines that you hear in Light of Freedom are not just made up, but they're actual words of real soldiers who fought in these battles.
And for me personally, the one thing I was determined I wanted to look so good was the river crossing. We don't get to do that as reenactors very often. What was good was reenactors have the experience historically. They know what the soldiers were doing. So as they came to the river, the crossing, if you look, some of them are kind of holding their cartridge box or trying to keep their stuff dry. The guys are holding on to their hats. When the Yankees come up, I distinctly remember Mike O'Connor, without anybody saying anything, knelt and fired. And that's one of my favorite moments as I look at that, is as the column or the troops are coming across, as he kneels and fires, I think, that's just natural. And that really gives you the impression that they were really right on the Confederates' heels. And I particularly like the scene as the Yankees kind of come across. It's almost like they're coming across the bank when those men with Garnett fire. And you do see a casualty or two amongst the Yankees before the Confederates are killed and captured there. And we researched and we found that Sergeant Reicheldifer was killed at Corrick's Ford. And every time we say the name Reicheldifer, people kind of look at us. But that was a real sergeant, and he was actually killed as is described in the movie. It was a cannonball through the body. Other details that were important, we portrayed that General Garnett was killed at Corrick's Ford. One of the things we found out was that the Union soldiers knew they had killed a general, but they didn't know who it was. And that brought my personal character in. I portrayed Major Love, which also gets a lot of laughs. But Major Love was a real character. We found out that he had been a West Point classmate of General Garnett, and he's the one who actually did identify the body.
News of the war being over has brought to me mixed emotions. There has been victory and much loss. The mixed emotions are made stronger while here in our nation's capital after President Lincoln's death.
After 90 days, the 14th reorganized for 3 years of the war. And a lot of those original 14th men rejoined other regiments or didn't rejoin the Army at all. So at the end, we went from portraying the 90-day men in Western Virginia, which was Eastern Theater, forge caps, things like that, to the final military scenes are just outside of Washington, D.C. And if you look, there are some differences. Some of the characters we've been seeing all the way through are gone, because some of those men didn't re-enlist. So that's a different feel. You have to be kind of looking for it, but the uniforms are different. You see some slouch hats instead of the forge caps. Slouch hats in modern terms is more the wide-brimmed or cowboy type hat. The tents, instead of having the big A-frames, are more dog tents or just shelter halves. So that was important for us. A lot of things, if you're not a Civil War historian, you may not pick them out. But for us, it was really important, even to the end, to be able to focus on those little details for us to know, we had done it right.
Well, there's not a lot to tell about George Richmond. I thought to myself that I want to find somebody real to do this. And so I did some research and discovered a man by the name of George Richmond, living in Westerville at the time that the Civil War began. and he was actually a veteran of the Mexican War. So what better person to introduce the main speaker at a Union rally in 1861 than a Mexican War veteran? And so I selected George Richmond as the person to portray, and then wrote the short speech using a lot of phrases that were common during recruiting rallies in the summer of 1861 to put together the speech for George Richmond.
The passion was ensuring that what we portrayed on screen was accurate. It's what the soldier went through. It's the uniform, it's the equipment, it's the food, it's all those things that as reenactors you try to replicate as best you can and to bring that to life on the screen. You know, you couldn't ask for a better group of reenactors, some who had never experienced a movie making process before. Everything was, again, as close as it could be to 1861.
One of the challenges of doing any kind of historical film is to present it with balance, but also to stay focused on what it is you're trying to achieve, I think. And I think everyone on Lighter Freedom was trying to stay really focused on the storyline that everyone was committed to of the main characters. And I think we did that very successfully by focusing on the people and not the politics or some larger issues that tend to happen, especially in Civil War films, and staying focused on the impact of the circumstances on these men. And I think one of the other things that often doesn't happen in a film is an accurate portrayal of the culture of the time. It's rare that you see the faith element portrayed the way it truly was historically. It's usually left out in Hollywood, but it was there, and it was very largely. Faith was a big part of the culture in the mid-19th century on both North and South. To leave it out is to not tell part of the story. So I'm very happy to see that that wasn't left out in Lighter Freedom, because without that part of the culture, you're not telling the whole story.
So we got to the premiere the first night, and the theater was almost full, and virtually almost all the reenactors who had large parts were there. And it was fascinating to see it on the screen and to see how it all came together, and to look up and think, you know, we're amateurs, you know, we're reenactors, we're historians, but we're certainly not actors. And it was a mixture of joy and pleasure, probably equal parts relief, that at the end I thought, wow, that was pretty good. And I remember thinking the first time I watched it, it came up to the most important part of the movie, which of course was my scene identifying General Garnett. And I thought, wait a minute, it's almost over. And I knew then that Kim and Josh and Mark and the whole team had really done what we set out to do. And it was important for me that it really focused on some of the little guys, you know, some of the private soldiers and what they went through. You know, I don't think they get near enough credit for 3 years of their lives that they gave up. You know, everybody knows the famous people, but nobody knows the little people. So I'm really thrilled with the project. Give me a couple years to recover, and maybe we'll do another one.